Cafe, your podcasting source of great crime, suspense, and thriller writing. I'm your host, Debbi Mack. Before I bring on my guest, I'll just remind you that the Crime Cafe has 2 ebooks for sale, the 9-book box set and the short story anthology. You can find the buy links for both on my website, debbimack.com, DEBBIMACK.com, under the Crime Cafe link. You can also get a free copy of either book if you become a Patreon supporter. You'll get that and much more if you support the podcast on Patreon, along with our eternal gratitude for doing so. Hi, everyone. My guest this week has extensive experience as a journalist. He's also written 2 award-winning nonfiction books. In addition, he's the author of the Kyle Dawson series, one of which he's giving away to a lucky reader. I'm pleased to have with me today author Peter Eichstaedt. Hi, Peter. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for being with us.
All right, my pleasure.
Okay. Well, first I have to say that I absolutely loved your guest post. And those of you who are listening, if you haven't read his guest post, just go to my blog for the Wednesday before this podcast and take a look. It's well done. Would you describe your fiction as being what sort of genre? Political thriller?
That's a good question. Uh, yeah, I like the thrillers designation, but I also like mysteries, and I would think I've tried to blend the two. Um, I don't know how successful I've been at that, but um, like I don't really feel like I write genre fiction, but I guess I do. If you need to put it into a category, it would be like a mystery thriller. But I think a lot of people, a lot of writers, kind of blend genres. So I don't know. I guess that's probably a good description of it. I usually what I've done is if, I feel compelled to have a story or to tell a story, and so the way I look at it is I use the devices I need to use to tell that story,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm less, I'm really more focused on that than anything else and trying to fit into a genre. I know um, a lot of times, when you're sending a book out and trying to find an agent or something like that, the agents want to know, what category. And they have all these admonitions on their websites. We don't represent this, we don't represent that, but we do represent this and that. So I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to make things fit.
I'm just thinking from a reader's perspective. Say, who would you compare yourself to?
Well, I like. Uh, I've always liked to. I wouldn't compare myself to anybody in particular, but I like uh, the Raymond Chandler mysteries. I really like those a lot, and that's kind of been my inspiration. And then on the other hand, too, though, I like uh, my favorite literary writer is Hemingway. Although I've written I've read and I've followed a lot of other more traditional literary works, but um, I like the reason I like Hemingway is because they're exotic locations and there's lots of action and there's lots of tension and I don't mean action like shoot 'em up, cowboys kind of things, but there's I don't know, activity, action in the story. So that's what I kind of shoot for. It's my goal.
So, sort of mystery thriller
Right, right.
with a hard boiled sensibility, let's say.
That's a good way to describe it. Sorting
Great.
through everything I said.
um, Let's see. Tell us about Kyle Dawson and what inspired you to write the series.
Well, what I wanted to, I've always thought that journalists would make um, good main characters and stories, and the reason is that as I you said, I read a lot of I've read a lot of detective fiction, and I and I've been a reporter for my entire life, until I retired, and I started off as a reporter at the age of 16, and with my own personal experience, and then looking at and then reading a lot of private eye fiction, I realized that journalists do a lot of the same work, and we have we're not motivated by finding out something for a high paying or secret client, but what we are interested in is finding the same information and verifiable so that we can print a story. And there's a lot of similarities, especially if you're an investigative reporter. So that's the that's my reason for using journalists as a main character. And I thought we do so much of the same work, and we have uh, a lot of the same risks. By uh, I've been threatened, and I know other journalists have, and they'll reluctant sometimes to write a story because you know what's going to happen, or the people that are the subject of your story know what's going to happen, and they don't want this information to be made public, so you're taking a risk.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, between those two comparisons, that's why I always thought journalists. I said, well, they're just as exciting and the same kind of dangerous work as a private eye would be, and kind of maybe like a public eye, I guess I would say.
It's a good. That's a good term. I like that. Um, did you intend from the start to write a series about this character?
Well, I had it's been my idea, initially. I thought uh, I could take this character and put it in a lot of different situations in a lot of different places. And I, uh, having traveled as much as I have, you know, I I started off with I didn't start off with, but my book Enemy of the People. Um, yeah, it was set in northern New Mexico, and the title was inspired by our president, who called journalists enemy of the people because they were digging up dirt, not necessarily digging up dirt, but they weren't, uh, writing down or saying what he said verbatim, and they were also questioning it and checking on the facts and seeing that our president kind of lives, it's gone on so much now. It's like it's kind of obvious that he lives in his own fantasy world, and a lot of what he says doesn't relate to reality, and it's not something that's very hard to dig up. And so uh, with him, that the whole notion of calling journalists enemy of the people just rankled me so badly. We are the representatives of the people. Because of what our president calling journalists the enemy of the people is what I felt compelled to write a story that showed that they were in fact not enemies, but they were representatives. They're upholders and protectors of the people.
I like that. I like that a lot. Right now, you have 2 or 3 books out in that series.
Uh, right now, I have two, but I've just finished up a third,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually a prequel. Um, it takes my character Kyle Dawson and puts him in Afghanistan, and it takes place sequentially before these other two novels. So it's, I don't know. I'm not selling it as a, I well, I'm still, it's with an agent right now. So um, I don't know if I'm going to want to sell it as a prequel, but just as another part of the series. But it takes place in advance, and in advance of the other two. And the reason I said it in Afghanistan is I've really wanted dearly to write a book about Afghanistan, in a fictional way. I have a nonfiction book about Afghanistan, and it's called Above the Din of War. And I spent 2 years as a consultant working in Afghanistan. I really like the country and the people, of course, but um, I always, like I said, I wrote a nonfiction book about it, but I wanted to set a fictional book there. So that's how that came about.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, your fiction does seem to be informed to a great extent by your nonfiction. Do you require much additional research when you're writing fiction?
I really don't. I pretty much draw on my experiences, and they shape, or and provide a good backdrop for what I want to write. And um, I was, looking at other works of fiction that are set in foreign locations, and depending on the writer, it varies a lot. But generally, the way fiction is structured, the focus is on the characters and their interactions, and there's less of an emphasis on, uh, detailed descriptions about the location. It's not always true. I know they can come up with many exceptions to that, but the focus of the story is always the characters, and secondarily is the backdrop. I know a lot of times too. Like say was somebody like Hemingway setting his story in Pamplona, Spain, or for the running of the bulls. Of course, that's really exotic, but even so, you still have the focus on the main characters and what they're doing, and that's the real story.
It always comes down to the characters, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
setting can make a book as well, but characters are essential. Good characters are essential to fiction, to
Yes.
good fiction. Um, so I noticed that Dawson has a kind of a sidekick and somebody named Raul Garcia. Is Garcia kind of like your tough guy sidekick in the same vein as, say, Hawk Dispenser in the Spencer novels?
Yeah, that's exactly a good way to a good way to put it. You know, I wanted to have uh, somebody in there, like you said, like a tough guy, somebody who can carry a gun, is authorized to carry a gun. And although I can't say it, generally speaking, journalists don't arm themselves, but I'm sure we can find exceptions. But like, for my own personal experiences working in Afghanistan, depending on, well, if we were going out into Taliban country, I always went with armed guards. And I went with the fortunately, I had some really good Afghan people who worked for me as translators, and they're the ones that made the arrangements. They arranged for the transportation, they arranged for security, and we, we would have, discussions about how safe it is to go someplace or how unsafe it is, and you know, luckily with telephone service being relatively good, we could call into the villages ahead and see if how it was doing. Was the Taliban near, or had they been there recently? And the locals knew, uh, you know, when it was safe and when it wasn't safe, and they knew what routes to come in, and so we would take precautions, common sense precautions, and
My
Anyway, I
gosh.
wanted to. I used all that to, you know, as backdrop for my books.
My gosh, your real life experiences sound more fascinating than fiction.
I know. Yeah, it's been. I know a lot of people thought it was crazy when I went back for a second year in Afghanistan, but I wanted to. I'd been there the first year, and then the opportunity came up, like 6 or 7 years later, to go back, and I thought, I want to write a book about this, so I'm going to go back and uh, I set up my schedule so that I was in my work so that I was able to travel around the country, and I would travel with local journalists, most of whom spoke English, and we had drivers and that kind of thing, so I could, um, we knew what was going on, where we could go, when we could go, how long we could stay, that kind of thing, and we could. Um, they were the ones that set up the interviews. If we had to like interview a villager or village chieftain or something outside of his village, and we could set that up, and we would make arrangements to do that so that everybody was, you know, uh, comfortable with the situation.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I've been reading a lot about female Marines and
Uh,
their role as not interpreters, but as
Security,
security and liaison in a way,
right, right.
and information gatherers. So
Yeah,
very
quite
interesting.
often they're the eyes and ears that are out there out on the front, so to speak, but in the more remote areas where um, you're more likely to find Taliban than you are, in the more larger population areas.
Oh, this is a fascinating topic, I got to tell you. And the idea of making it the backdrop for your fiction is very intriguing.
Uh-huh.
What's the latest thing you're working on now?
Well, I just finished up a book, and that's like I said, uh, it's a prequel, and it's called The Correspondent, and it's set, like I said, ahead of these other ones, and I'm kind of looking for at the moment. Like I said, it's sitting with an agent, so I'm waiting to hear back, and I have a if I can't. If I can't get it with the people I'd like to get it with in New York, I can. I always there's a mid-sized publisher here in Denver that really likes my work, and so I can always go with them. But I prefer to go with this biggest publishing house possible.
That's understandable. Um, and can you give us a brief description of what the latest one? I mean, when I say the latest, I mean Enemy of the People. That one is about.
Yeah.
What's the story about?
Well, Enemy of the People, like I said, was inspired by our president calling journalists the enemy of the people, and so I uh, I set it where in a place I know well. I lived in New Mexico for a long time, and so I set it in a resort um, area in northern New Mexico, which is fictional, but Taos is of course a ski area, but then there's another uh, ski area up there called Angel Fire, and it's a really beautiful summer resort as well as winter resort, and so I decided to set it up there because it would be I thought it would be a perfect place to have a semi-secret meeting between the president and say his high-ranking opposition, like which would be the president pro tem of the Senate and then Speaker of the House. He's if you're in a situation which what I had in mind was a situation where um, President Obama was a liberal president and he was faced with uh, Republican majorities in or at least significant Republican conservatives in both houses. So it requires this delicate balance of, um, you know, political give and take. And so I thought, well, what if I put these three people, these three key individuals in a resort? And the reason they're there, of course, is to work out some kind of secret deal where they can each accomplish pieces of their agenda. It's not completely secret, but like semi-secret. They got a small coterie of the press there. They're having meetings, and I thought it had the political legitimacy that was necessary, and I wanted to put it in a relatively remote location, and uh, so I put it in like a resort in northern New Mexico, and I also, being in New Mexico, it also gave it access to um, what I would call the terrorist groups who in my story, they come up through Mexico, um, and then they're very focused on what they're going to do, and taking the president or at least holding him hostage, and I the other thing is I've also, one of my nonfiction books is about the U.S. situation along the U.S. Mexico border. It's called The Dangerous Divide, and I spent many months. Well, besides living in New Mexico, but I spent a lot of time traveling up along the border, going to in Tucson and then in New Mexico, and to get a sense of it. And the reality is, despite what President Trump says about border security, there's a lot of open areas that are just open, open desert. And in some instances, it's nothing but a barbed wire fence that's fallen down and rusted. So, like President Trump is very concerned about, uh, what he calls an open border, but it's been like that for, I don't know, probably 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not as much of a problem as he would like it to be, partly because there are vast stretches of desert there where it's just dangerous to cross. You need to have provisions, you need to have transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sure that's where of course, as you can imagine, that's where a lot of the illegal drugs come across and that kind of thing. But the
Mm-hmm.
fact of the matter is, it's not like having an open door where you have millions of people pouring through into this country. And the reality is that's just not the reality of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, with my familiarity with the border, uh, I just wanted to use that as a backdrop.
Well, your fiction really does sound intriguing as well as your nonfiction. Um, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we finish up?
Um, no, I continue to uh, work on fiction that's based on either my personal experiences or my travels. And one of the ideas I've always had with my fiction is to bring some of these foreign locations where I've lived, bring them to life, bring them into people's lives by setting my fictional stories there. And not only, you know, my ideal is to not only transport people into another world via the characters, but also to transport them to places, exotic places where they've never been via the backdrops and the settings.
Well, that's fantastic. I think that's a great thing.
All right.
And
Well,
it's nice to see somebody using travel in that way. I mean, I know other authors who do that, but using travel in that manner, to express a place and people in it, it's really good. And having a
yeah.
journalism background, I think, helps a lot.
Yeah, I know. It really informed. I mean, it influences my fiction a lot. I had somebody, without I don't going over time, but I had someone um, comment that my they were looking at my fiction and saying, "Well, your paragraphs are very short," and I looked back and I said, "Yeah," I said, "This got it. Definitely is my it's got to be my journalism background." But then um, I'm sure you're familiar with the mystery writer Tony Hillerman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, his daughter and I were really good friends. We worked together, and she's now writing fiction, and she's picked up the thread of her father, and she's writing mystery novels that um, use the same characters, and she's added a female Navajo detective to the anyway. So she and I are good friends, but she also writes those short paragraphs. I'm reading one of her books right now, and but I think I don't know. I think that's kind of a trend, especially in popular fiction now. It's a lot of short paragraphs, lots of dialogue, and
I agree, and I'm
yeah,
totally into that.
yeah. I think it makes for good fast reads, and I think it's good because one, people are like right now we're on the internet and people spend a tremendous amount of time on the internet reading, and so you need to have something that's fast paced that grabs people's attention. There's these long ponderous novels are a thing of the past, I think.
I agree. I agree with you there. A lot of people are
Yeah,
writing shorter now.
yeah, yeah. I
Well,
know. So 70 to 80,000 word novels is not unusual at all.
yeah, and not that bad a thing, really,
Right,
or
right.
even shorter. Lots of novellas are coming out now. Well, Peter, I just want to thank you for being here. It's
All
really
right.
great to have you on.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much, and I appreciate the call. And sorry we had that clunkiness to get connected, but
No problem. Hey, we managed to muscle through it. So I'll just say, let's hear it for the fourth estate and for journalists.
yeah,
It's only the First Amendment, right, folks?
that's right. That's right.
And on that note, I'll just add that you can find the Crime Cafe 9-book set and short story anthology on all major retailers, or you can get a copy when you become a patron on Patreon of the podcast. In fact, I'm thinking of further expanding the content I'm going to provide to patrons of the podcast there. In the meantime, look for the podcast and the books on my website, debbimack.com, DEBBIMACK.com. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you in 2 weeks when our guest will be Richard Cahill Jr., and in the meantime, happy reading.